Morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to see people back here, especially, old friends from across the world and lots of younger people in the room. Over the years, Urban Arc has become an interesting place for us to ask pretty harsh and, difficult questions. We kind of privilege this conference of ours by trying to give space to younger scholars and academics to actually speak and to sort of contest with each other and with other colleagues on core questions. So as you go through this and you step outside, what you'll see is that we've tried to pick up on a wide range of critical themes that deal with, heterodox ways, or let's say plural ways of trying to engage with the urban. But today, I normally start on a somewhat positive note, but the state of the world is quite exciting at the moment. But more than that, when I went through the abstracts for the conference this time, in some senses I was a little disappointed. So, normally one doesn't start a conference with a sense of disappointment. And the reason I was disappointed was I'd hoped to see a much more critical and engaged deliberation on these questions, given that we're, living through very, very sharp and difficult times. And what I see is, and I hope, the conference will actually undo that, is a fairly straightforward, direct, linear response to, in a sense, a set of questions that we've laid out here. So people are talking about things, but they're talking about things in particular sets of buckets and from the spaces they come from the institutions they come from, etc. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to be a bit bolder than you are in your extended abstracts. I know extended abstracts are not the easiest way of sort of finding your way into a place. And what we found over the years is in these 2 or 3 days, the conversations actually will lead to I would say more than criticality, to some kinds of propositions in the space. And the reason I'm saying that is that we are really at a very difficult juncture in time. It's pretty obvious now, more or less across the world, that we're in the middle of a very serious systemic crisis. Right? I mean, some people call it a polycrisis, other people call it a meta-crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And this affects everything we do. I mean, as individuals, as communities, as people who work on ideas and on things. And I think we need to recognize that. And part of that story is about the question of margins. Fine? So, the question of margins has been dealt with historically in lots of different ways. In economics, for a long time, we've been seeing this, I would say for the last 60, 70 years at least, in questions of dependency theory and, centers and peripheries, et cetera. But I think we really have to go well beyond that. And I think one of the core, maybe analytical questions that we should be asking ourselves, because many of us work on urban questions, on the questions of urbanization. And here when I'm talking about urbanization, I'm not talking about urbanization as a demographic process or a demographic, fact, or even an economic fact that, we have people who are much more urban than they were before. But I'm talking about this in a social-cultural reality, because fundamentally, the process of urbanization, this megatrend that we're seeing that's going to expand in this geography and has expanded in the 20th century across other geographies, especially Latin America and now increasingly across Africa, is something that's going to be a defining element of the Anthropocene. And why am I saying the Anthropocene? I mean, it's become quite fashionable now to say everything is situated in the Anthropocene. But the Anthropocene changes everything. And why does it change everything? Because much of what we do, as people who work and think about particular sets of things, are in a context. And this 10,000-year context is over. Fine? It ended in the 1950s, technically. The geologists have basically said the age of man as we know it, this is after the age of reason and so many other things, the age of man as we know it is at least 60 or 70 years old, depending on where you look at it, but certainly the mid-1950s. So everything we talk about, biophysically, the agricultural systems, the ecological systems that support us. Of course, climate is the most obvious thing that we look at. And hence, all the societies, the cultures, the economies that we're talking about are in a completely different regime than what they were. And we're at the edge of this. Some of us have been seeing this and talking about this for a while. I mean, these questions were certainly raised quite systemically in the 1970s. And, again and again, we've heard them come back. But this is a significant, and I would say an almost irretrievable regime shift. I work on climate, so we can say that from a biophysical reality, but from a social-cultural reality, from a political reality, from a governance reality, this is a very clear thing to look at. So, the first, I guess, core question I think I would encourage you to think about is urbanization has been with us for a long while, okay? In this 10,000 year period, this so-called Goldilocks period that we talk about of the Holocene, which has enabled us as a species to touch 8 billion, now maybe touch 10 billion, et cetera, et cetera. This sort of climate window. To that added a whole use of natural resources, so to speak, whether it's water first or biofuels, and then now, of course, fossil fuels, have enabled us to take out this space. But this space is shifted. It will probably not come back to this. Some parts of it will not come back maybe for 1,000 years or more. Right? Some things may come back in the century. Okay? So the question, one of the first question that I'd ask is, in this context, are urbanization and marginality actually sort of joined at the hip? Okay? Is a distinguishing characteristic of this 5,000 year history of urbanization, which we've not done very well. I mean, we celebrate urbanization as having done lots of remarkable things. Most empires, many cultures, a lot of knowledges are fundamentally created in urban spaces. And urban spaces, I don't mean metropolitan spaces, whether it were ancient cities or current ones that are there. So urban spaces is the entire system that's there. It helps to do various things. It concentrates people, opportunities, institutions, cultures, etc. And it gives us certain ways of being able to do things that we couldn't do it if we were in spatial sense or a temporal sense rather, differently organized. So I guess one of the core questions is an endemic part of the urban condition or the process of urbanization marginality? Okay? I mean, if there were no institutionalized inequalities in our urban systems and hence our urban centers, because multi-scalar process, would what we have today be possible? This is a very old question. It's not a new one, and it's been institutionalized for a long time. For example, gender injustice and slavery were endemic parts still, let's say, 200 years ago of pretty much every society, and they were highly concentrated in urban areas. And we know the history of this. We understand that. Social scientists obviously look at these questions that say, the question is there a continuity between the past that we see and the present that we're living in, right? So, that's I think a very simple question, but it's a hard question to answer. But the facts seem to speak very clearly to the reality that if you didn't have peripheries and margins at the local level, and it goes all the way up, inside a neighborhood, inside a city region, inside a national territory, and of course across the world. And this shifts over time. So if this dimensionality of difference in some senses were not in place, the question is, would you actually have the kind of form of urbanization that we have today? And is that sort of inevitable? And we've researched this question in the Indian context on things that you can research on because they're easy to measure. And there's some interesting stories that come from. And of course, economics deals with this question quite clearly. And if you step back on that, one of the core questions that emerges from us, which is relatively easy to kind of measure, is the world itself is very diverse, and there's massive anisotropy. Things are not equal in various places on access to resources, availability of various things. Okay, so that's the reason, for example, why typically cities and settlements have clustered where water is. That's kind of the history in some sense. We forget it because today we think we're untethered to the planet because we can take anything anywhere, we can go to Mars, etc., etc. But effectively, the history of place and settlement is tied to highly unequal spatial inequality. So spatial inequality in the sense is kind of obvious. Yeah, so some resources are available in certain places. Today, if you want to make a transition in the renewable economy, and you need to have you need to have storage, fine, it's dependent on where the lithium is, and the lithium is in 5 places in the world. So that straight away starts giving you a geopolitics, a geoeconomics, etc. And you can take that for sort of pretty much every resource that's there. And because the nature of cities is such that some critical flows are not produced inside cities, yeah? So for example, cities don't produce enough food for themselves. We work a lot here on urban and peri-urban agriculture. So just structurally, cities and city regions don't produce enough food for themselves, which means that every single empire, from the Qin in China to the Roman Empire to everything that's there, their own security and the functionality of their urban systems and cultures and politics is dependent on being able to access food. Now, in today's day and age, we don't think of those questions. But the fact is, if we don't have a global food trade system, both now and certainly by the 2050s, 500 million people are going to, be in famine conditions and potentially die. So, and that's because of the nature of the specialty that we work with, that's the nature of urbanization. Some things are produced and consumed and are organized in particular places and some are not. So obviously one element of dealing with marginality is the question of space. So as people who are urbanists and know urban questions, obviously spatiality is a very critical part of what we're happening. And spatiality operates at multiple scales. So I just took you through that, from the hyperlocal all the way to the global. Now the difference between now and maybe 100 years ago, and certainly 200 years ago, is that the local to the global are actually deeply connected, right? So 100 years ago, we had 1.25, 1.3 billion people. We're at 8 at the moment, so the world is very full. And as we've seen very explicitly in our own personal experiences of COVID, lots of interesting things can happen when the world is full of people and they're deeply interconnected. And I don't mean only on the internet, because that's obviously there, and in social media, but I also mean in physical terms. So if you look at how the propagation, first within China, and then across the world happened of COVID, it happened in China basically because China is extremely well connected. And the outbreak from Wuhan started at the time when the Spring Festival was moving, and then you have these fantastic urban networks that are connected with high-speed trains. So you propagate it, and then from there it starts with airlines, and then it gets across the world in a few weeks. So we're in a deeply connected world, fine, which is very different from what it was in the past. The question then is, how equal or unequal is this deeply connected world? And how does it play itself out? And I think, again, speaking to both our lived experience and the literature which is now emerging from COVID, COVID really showed us very, very clearly how these anisotropies play themselves out. So, effectively, the very odd thing is the world economy shuts down, fine, and economic output drops very dramatically. But wealth creation and inequality of holding wealth actually increases. Seems like a bit of a dichotomy, but that's a fact. Pretty much everything you see, all major economic indicators, and of course our own lives spoke to that thing, went downhill, but wealth, and I'm just taking that because it's very obvious, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess one of the questions is, in the system that we're living in, the system that we're working in, systems that we're researching is this an endemic nature of what we're doing, right? And we have to look at this across multiple dimensions. And fortunately, unfortunately, they're connected. Yeah, so when you look at these things, obviously there's a spatial aspect of it, which I've dealt with this now. There's also a temporal aspect of this. We think of spatial scale, and many of us, because we're trained spatially, we understand that and we can navigate that. Many disciplines have difficulty doing that, but from historians to urbanists, there are a whole range of people who do that. But there are also things to do with temporal scale. We don't think of that very often. So if you're a bee or let's say a bird, your life cycle, or a human being, or a country, or a nation, or whatever institution that's there, our life cycles actually have different temporal scales, fine? So our clock time, as we call it, and we should know about clock times because, we're all living on this clock time that's defined by a chip sitting somewhere in our phones in some senses, fine? There's also a spatiality of time. And when you bring together a spatiality of space and time, how you actually deal with and how you navigate inequalities of space and time is very important. It seems like an abstract concept, but in actual fact, what is money in some ways? Money, or at least your income, forget about money. Our individual income is what? It's a sum of the lifetime that we have. The number of hours that we have, we spend some of it in work, and most of us are not rich enough to be able to live on somebody else's past incomes, so we have to work to do that. And effectively, the time that you have is translated into an income. That income effectively is your life, right? And you sum all of everybody's lives, and you have wealth. And you have wealth inequality because the rules about how one person's life is less or more than the others are defined by a certain set of social constructs. And those of you who know Piketty and his own critique of this process, it is the relationship between these different forms of capital in some ways that defines in some ways structural inequality, and the question of who's at the margins, who's at the peripheries, and how marginality is constructed. It's constructed, fine. It's socially it's agreed, it's embedded in our institutions, and it's reproduced year on year and process on process. And the really critical thing in this is we understand space, but we also have to understand time. Because if the rate of how we do things shifts, fine, it's not only inequality in terms of who is where and who is what and who has access to whatever it is, and whether it's economic distance. So you're in a particular community in the city, and it takes you, let's say the city is much better than others, half an hour every morning to go and get water. That's sort of physical distance to access to the resource, or if you're a textile worker in this city and you actually walk to work because you can't afford to do anything else. So there's questions of distance, physical distance, and a lot of work on infrastructure and processes are about distances. And then, of course, there are questions of economic distance, fine? And we measure this in economics, so things like, Gini coefficient actually measures distances. It's, in a sense, it's a moment-based thing that looks at distances. And then social distance. So there are many forms of distances. And the question then is, if distance is an accepted frame to be able to organize and sort of develop and manage systems, how do we navigate the space, and what do we accept as the normal, either historical normal, or the current normal, or the future normal, right? And this works itself out in very pragmatic ways. You may think, I'm talking in very abstract terms, but when we negotiate, and I've been a negotiator at the UN over time, and maybe 7 or 8 years ago, 10 years ago almost, we started negotiating these sustainable development goals, fine? And the most contested goals, for those of you who know this, were goal 5 on gender, right? Because I think in some senses the most significant element of social justice is around gender, at least for me and for many of us who think about this thing. Gender is like the organizing principle on which distance is organized in society, and it's historically been so. So SDG 5 and SDG 10, which is about economic distance in some senses, inequality, economic inequality, these were very difficult to negotiate. They were very tough. But at the end of this, what emerged was a very interesting set of ideas. And they're simple ideas, and they have they echo historical processes. And the idea was very simple. The ideas were in 3 things. One is the idea of leaving no one behind. So it's an implicit. Of course, behind, is often about who's ahead and who's behind. It's often in terms of class. It's often in terms of ethnicity. It's in India, of course, it's centrally about caste. It's about hierarchy, fine? So who's behind and who's ahead? Yeah, so it's very clear. It's there in the 2030 agenda. It says, we're committed to doing all these things, meeting these goals. It's a collective sort of aspiration of all the countries in the world. At the moment, I don't think we'll ever be able to achieve that kind of collectivity given the world that it is at the moment. But that was in spite of all these great goals saying that we should have gender equality, etc. We said the basic principle was you should leave no one behind. But tied to the idea of leaving no one behind were 2 other ideas which I think are very important for us in this room. And that was the idea of leaving no place behind, right? Because historically, in the development sphere, in many of the canonical disciplines, especially economics, the idea of spatial injustice or the idea of spatial inequality is absent. In fact, in many ways, especially since, I would say, the 18th and 19th century, the organization of states, maybe not firms, but states, are not based on the idea of spatiality. Historically, when you had much more decentralized systems and cultures, governance was organized, across the landscape. But the modern nation state has been created and constructed around, of course, ideas of territory very much, but also around the idea of centralization. And in fact, all the big debates many of the big debates we've been seeing over the last 150 or 200 years are about the question of, who's more marginal than others? How can we deal with some forms of spatial justice? How can we deal with questions of regional inequality and other such things that are there? So the first idea is no person, because in a sense, both agency and let's say entitlement are tied to people, but the idea of place and people also becomes an interesting thing. And then finally, something which is not explicitly stated, but I think is pretty important. So the idea is basically you leave no one behind, you leave no place behind. So you are able to deal with all places across the world, in every country, in a hyperlocal to national sense, but also you can't leave any ecosystem behind. That's a kind of a very, it's a pretty heterodox idea. And what that recognizes is the relationship between people, place, and the things that exist in that place which allow people to be there. So it seems like a radical idea, but it's actually very simple, and in the current context is absolutely important, because in the Anthropocene, we cannot take for granted that wherever we are is where we will be in the future. Fine? Simple reality is, if there's going to be sea level rise, a lot of our great cities are basically going to first be challenged, and then they disappear. And this is not a new thing, it's happened historically over time. Yeah? So if you think back before the Holocene, there were land bridges between, let's say, the UK and France. So people could walk back and forth. And we know there's settlements in the intermediate period. Archaeology talks to us. Same thing, land bridges between Asia through Indonesia all the way into Australia. That's how the Great Migrations, we know this. I mean, this is pretty well known, science delivers to that. So that's just one simple example. If the landscape changes, if the spaces in which places can be shift, if the glaciers melt, and I think these are all things which we know are actually going to happen in our lifetimes, not in somebody else's lifetimes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, things will shift very dramatically. So we cannot take for granted that the ecosystems that support us are going to work. And why is that so? Because the age of fossil things is kind of coming to an end. So the most obvious ones are fossil fuels, including oil and gas and then coal. But the other one that is very critical to people and to places is water, is a very serious challenge, fine? So, now we know that we're at the limits as far as water is concerned. Water is a global limit that's being hit. We work extensively on this. My colleagues here are some of the leading researchers in this space. So it's just if I take these two things and I can go through various other things, those possibilities have shifted or will shift very dramatically, literally in our own lifetimes. So the places where you can sit, the basis on which, the spatial basis on which economic activity will play itself out, and hence how firms and societies are going to organize themselves, that's going to shift very, very dramatically. So the question then is, if you work in a landscape which is anisotropic, things are differently in different places, not only in space but in time, and a lot of what we see in the digital age is not a colonization of space, it's actually a colonization of time. And we have to be very careful to be able to unpick and address this, fine? Effectively, what the internet is doing, what digital technologies are doing, is that they're taking over our time. Yeah? And if you're able to very powerfully take over both time and space, you're effectively able to control both processes, fine? And there were ways of taking over time earlier, and like I said, slavery is one way of doing it. And another way of doing it, of course, is institutionalizing inequalities and letting people believe that they're inferior to others. So, your time can be taken by somebody else, by a particular task, a particular occupation, a particular role, gender, or otherwise, fine? So, we have to think, I think, in a somewhat sort of heterodox manner as far as this is concerned. So when we're talking about marginalities, marginality in terms of class, or let's say economic activity, is closely linked to other forms of marginality. So I said, and if we're able to examine both here and outside this, the connection between all of these processes and how they link to each other, that would be something that I think would be very useful, not only in the abstract, in the question of theory, but also using practical examples to test these processes. Because as I said, we're at the edge of a production possibility frontier, not in physical or economic terms, but in epistemic terms in some senses. This is a space that we don't understand. And if we look at the question of how we manage and think about and organize our knowledges, there's some basic principles on which it's sort of the current paradigms are based on. One basic principle is a lot of what worked in the past works in the present and will work in the future. Fine? So there's a continuity of knowledge, and there's a universality of these knowledges in various places and times. Fine? I mean, that's what Euclid was all about. That's what the mathematical and the scientific paradigm is based on, that you can universalize certain processes. And of course, some of us contest those ideas, but I think that's an important assumption to be able to deal with, because if you do not respect the inequality and structural inequality in the systems that you have, and you assume that historical understandings and historical processes are going to continue in the past, you might be in a very difficult and contested space, because many of these things don't apply anymore. If you apply the principles of the past in terms of how society was organized, with the present and the future, you might be in a very difficult place. And I think that's the reality of, if you look at planning in cities, for example, planning in cities is based on an imagination of what the social construct, the physical construct, the infrastructure constructs of the place, and they don't hold anymore. Fine? And you can see that transition. We really look at that quite effectively. So that's one thing. The second thing is that things actually equilibrate. That things will balance themselves out. And many disciplines are fundamentally based on the idea of equilibrium. But if you look at economic systems today, for example, most of the processes that we're seeing just now, or many of the processes, are driven by far-from equilibrium processes. So war, for example, most economists are not trained in dealing with war economies. Fine? That's not, there's a whole literature about, including Keynes, etc., on how you manage a war economy. And that's why we struggle so much during the COVID years because economic planners, people who manage economies, had very little understanding of the analytics of actually managing their processes. So if we did and we had a better understanding of that in our institutions, whether it's central banks or whatever, ministries of finance and, and all the other bureaucracies that manage these things, we wouldn't have done some of the things that we did, including shut down complete countries. And that's true of this country and many other countries in some senses. So we do not understand how to manage far from equilibrium systems very well in pretty much everything we do. Yeah. So a lot of the science and an increasing amount of the social sciences, because unfortunately they've drawn a little bit too much from the sciences, are based on this idea of equilibrium-based systems. Here at IIHS, we work a lot on far from equilibrium systems, because that's the way reality actually plays itself out. And how does that play itself out in urban areas? It plays itself out in questions of informality. Fine? Informality actually is a very lazy word in some senses. It's talking about things that are not where they should be doing because there's a particular normal, and the normal sits around the equilibrium. Fine? The reality of this round of urbanization, the urbanization that we started seeing in East Asia, which is now huge, the largest urbanization in history, the one that is in motion at the moment in South Asia, and the one that's already started in Africa, is fundamentally about a different way of doing things. It's not around an imagination or a normal which came from other contexts, fine? Whether the context was 19th century Europe or late 19th century, early 20th century North America, or mid and late 20th century Latin America. Okay? The context is fundamentally different. Yeah? So we have to examine processes in that context. So in some senses, understanding how far from equilibrium works, which is actually understanding the dynamics of the margin, yeah, is very important. And in any system, and the most dramatic examples of this is every imperial system that we've seen, and we've seen, those of you who know a little bit about world systems theory, if you look at the different waves of globalization, this is probably the fourth or fifth wave of globalization. People trying to talk about globalization that we invented just now. It's been around for a long time. The end of the transition from one wave to the other wave was always driven by movements from the margin. The most obvious one, of course, is sort of the Mongolian revolution that basically united Europe and Asia and became Eurasia in some senses, fine? That basically connected up two different worlds, and it did lots of different things as far as they're concerned. Of course, Alexander tried to do that a little bit earlier, and he didn't completely succeed, but he did that in a particular context. So basically, when a system transitions, most of the dynamics of that emerges from the margins. And I guess, people who work on ecological systems and how that's organized around patches and niches, etc., understand this very clearly. Because when you're looking at a transition in a system, either forced or otherwise, it is the residual resilience that sits in the margins that actually will determine how the next regime will play itself out. But the challenge for us, because we work largely embedded in social and economic systems and cultural systems, is we have a tremendous inertia that doesn't sit in the physical or the economic reality, it sits in the cultural reality. So we're able to reproduce and reconstruct processes even though the system shifts. And why do we do that? Because we're continuously mining the past as a way of managing the present and the future. So whether it's nativism at one end, or it is going back to certain historical cultural imaginations of the way the world was and going back, and this is not only true of what's happening at the current point of time in history or in culture. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, because you're taking something that did work in a particular context, you're setting it up on a pedestal, and you're trying to reconstruct your response to a very different, dynamically changing present and an even more unknown future using that frame. That's problematic, when you look at it. It's like the old story, if you have a pan and you put a whole lot of frogs like us into it and the pan is hot, the frogs will jump out of the pan, fine. But if into that pan you start adding water and the water slowly starts boiling, the frogs don't move. They'll croak, like most of us do, but they won't move out of that. So if you're in a regime where we believe that things are very close to the equilibrium, and that's the framework that actually works, that we can always manage the margins and the peripheries with the centers, et cetera, whether it's spatially or temporally or across different disciplines, we get lazy. And that was, in a sense, my provocation at the moment. But I think, if we can be less lazy over the next 2 or 3 days and really contest some of these ideas, not think of them from our own silos, from the disciplines that we come from the ways that we're looking at things, the context that we are at the moment, and really try and unpick them in fairly, provocative ways. That would be something that would be useful. And I think we have the energy both inside the room and outside the room. We know what we're sitting in at the current point of time. The debates that we're seeing across the world on questions of Gaza, questions of what's happening in Ukraine, something that might actually happen in Taiwan. The world system is in a period of very significant shift. And very often what happens is these transitions often lead to one set of folks who are actually being oppressed to become the oppressors of the next system. That's the power of social reproduction and the power of certain ideas about who we are, what our identities are, where culture and history rise. And that's why we're saying going back to that equilibrium idea and going to far is a very important way of trying to sort of unpick and look at these questions. So even the idea of leaving no one behind, leaving no place behind, leaving no ecosystem behind, has embedded within it certain frames of let's say, universality, which actually is something that we may want to contest and look at because of the diversity of it. So I'll stop there, but I think you have a wonderful opportunity over the next 2 or 3 days to engage with these questions, think about them, meet and talk to a whole range of people here, because conferences are not only about papers. Papers are a good way of doing that. They're actually an invitation to meet people and talk to them. Unfortunately, if you're online, that becomes a little bit challenging, but I guess you get to know who's in the room and who we can talk to. And so, yeah, I hope we're able to open an interesting dialogue and have some fun over the next 2 or 3 days. And I'm looking forward to spending some time with you folks. Thanks, Neha.
Thanks.